I'm Lindsay Chalmers. I'm the Development Manager at Community Land Scotland. So part of my role is to support communities. So myself and some other colleagues work with communities to help them go through the community right to buy process. So our knowledge of the subject has been built up through hands-on work with communities. So there's two reasons why community right to buy came about in Scotland. The first was that Scotland's got very highly concentrated land ownership, some of the most concentrated land ownership in the developed world. So when the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, one of the main priorities was to try and diversify land ownership. So they were looking at ways to do that. But also in the 1990s, several communities had bought their own land. They were fortunate in a way that the land had come on the market, which gave them the opportunity to buy and develop the land. But what they did was so positive and made so much change. The Scottish Parliament wanted to recognise that this was a really good model and there should be more opportunities for communities to own land. So community right to buy is quite complicated, but the kind of essentials of community right to buy, there's a few different features to it. So it can be used to buy almost any land and buildings owned by public sector or private sector. It can only be used by geographically based communities with democratic ownership models. Communities have to show that there's widespread support in the community. So in the early stages, they need to get people to sign a petition of at least 10% of people who live in the community. It has to be in the public interest as well, so it can't be used to stop development, and also has to be for the benefit of the sustainable development of the community, so for economic, environmental, or social reasons. There's 4 different types of community right to buy, but the one that's been used most commonly is called a preemptive right, which only kicks in when the land or buildings comes up for sale and effectively gives the communities kind of first right of refusal on the asset. There's also 3 compulsory rights to buy: crofting, one for abandoned and neglected land, one for purchasing assets for sustainable development, but those are less used than the preemptive ones and are probably a bit more complicated. So community right to buy has been around for around 20 years now. I think it's important to say that as well as actually helping practically in communities getting ownership of land and buildings, that it really changed the culture around what communities could have. For the first time, it kind of brought in this idea that property rights weren't absolute and communities also had rights. So it really changed the culture around community ownership and change the culture in Scotland so that communities could say, well, yes, we've got a right to own land and buildings as well, and there's routes to do that. But practically, it's also helped 24 communities take on land and buildings, which is a wide range of different things. So a few former MOD bases, churches, the whole island of Ulva, a forest that used to be owned by Richard Attenborough. So quite a wide range of different assets have been brought in through community right to buy.
Hi, my name is Josh Doble. I'm the Policy Manager at Community Land Scotland. So community right to buy is not working as well as it should or could for a number of reasons. So it was introduced over 20 years ago, and there's a kind of natural period of the landscape changing, legal precedent changing, the bureaucracy changing, and it just needs updating to reflect the realities of the land market and the bureaucratic landscape in 2025. In terms of issues in the wider land market, so land prices have increased a lot since the early 2000s and have increased quite dramatically even in the last 5 years. So communities are just being priced out, which means that things like the Scottish Land Fund, which was set up to deliver community right to buy, because you need to have the funding organised in order for something like community right to buy to work, it just simply isn't fit for purpose. Particularly large land holdings. Scotland has a lot of large land holdings and they're simply out of the reach of communities. There's also been established kind of legal precedent over the last 20 years, which has consistently found in favour of landowners against either the Scottish Government or against communities. So there needs to be something that tackles that, so a stronger statement of intent from the Parliament and from the Government that actually community rights when it's proved to be in the public interest, should trump these private rights, and then the judiciary can kind of follow suit. Because we're still finding that the courts are very conservative when it comes to deciding on any cases which end up in court. There's also bureaucratic challenges. There's things like when signatures need to be collected for a ballot to show local community support for community right to buy, it needs to be wet signatures on paper rather than anything online. And so there's this kind of some administrative challenges which could be dealt with quite quickly. And the government is reviewing community right to buy. The government recognises there's issues with it. And it's just really about updating it and make sure it's strong and fit for purpose for the rest of the 2020s. Yeah, so I think a number of things can change. So I think a simplification of the rights. At the moment, there's been a kind of a growth in the number of rights, which has already been explained. We have kind of 5 rights now. Maybe it would make sense to simplify that into having one preemptive right, which has been used quite a lot, and then one absolute right, which would be a forced sale of land when it's not in the public interest to the community. With the addition of specific provisions for crofting communities, because protecting some of the specific aspects of the crofting community right to buy is important. But what I'd like to see happen is those absolute rights being used more. So we have one example in Scotland. In Fife, there's a community who have used Part 5, which is the right to buy land for further sustainable development. The Scottish Government found in their favour and said this piece of derelict land should be sold to the community because their development plans were better than the private landowners, which was an asset management group in the Isle of Man. That is now in the courts, so we have to see if the courts are going to find in favour of the landowner or with the Scottish Government and communities. But if we start to see those rights being used, so communities forcing the sale of land that's essentially not being used in the public interest, that's lying vacant and derelict, or it's just not being used, that's really exciting. And if we see a simplification of the rights, then we'd see communities actually starting to kind of reuse them again. At the moment, because of this legal challenge, the bureaucratic complexity, the price of land, community right to buy is not being engaged with as much as it should be. But if we simplify some of that, and we see other land reform mechanisms come in which drop the price of land, then actually we're going to see it kind of returning to being the kind of central pillar of land reform in Scotland that it used to be.